Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Fort Wayne Local Podcast. I'm your host, Jake McAfee. Today, I'm really excited. We got a special guest. His name is Jason Arp, and he's a member of City Council. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thanks again for your patience. We had a little technical difficulties earlier, but you hung in there. So I'm going to give a quick background, and then we'll jump right in. So Jason's represented the 4th District of Fort Wayne, which is the southwest and south portion, since November of 2015, currently serving his second term. Originally grew up in North Carolina and got his BSBA in finance from East Carolina University. He then went on to do some global corporate investment banking in Chicago, where you managed derivative operations, and then worked for Bank of America in Charlotte until 2006, where he specialized in mortgage-backed securities and interest rate derivatives. He now owns J. Arp and Company LLC, where he manages a variety of proprietary investments. He's married with 2 children. Your wife's originally from the area, correct?
That's right.
Okay, and lives in Southwest Fort Wayne. So I guess my first question is, after a history in finance and banking, what got you into politics?
I became a little bit interested when I was still at the bank. It was a salesperson for UBS, Union Bank in Switzerland, one day posted on her Bloomberg terminal. You can read this is kind of the pre-Facebook days, back in the late 90s, early 2000s. We all had personalized Bloomberg terminals. They had your name on it and everything. So when you're communicating with somebody, like trade sizes and that kind of stuff, they can make a profile page, and hers said, "Who is John Galt?" And I did a little bit of research and found out that was a reference to Atlas Shrugged, which is Ayn Rand's famous kind of libertarian opus. And that kind of got me interested in politics a little bit. Not necessarily politics, but in policy, or the ideas of the nature of government. And then I was inspired by Ron Paul's 2008 run for president, and the outcome of the financial disaster and the way that the government mismanaged the financial collapse kind of got me interested, and never really planned on running for city council. It's just one of those things that when my city council representative decided to run for mayor, they left the open seat, and upon investigation of what all was going on, I decided I would run to fill his seat. I thought it'd be a good learning experience, and an opportunity to try to represent the people in my district, represent their best interest.
Okay, so you just saw maybe some things that you thought could be done better. Instead of doing what most people do, which is complain about it, you decided to do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, if someone's not standing up for the individual, then it's very easy for them to get run over. I mean, I know most of the things on our agenda to talk about are related to economic development and finance related questions, so I won't get into a lot of the other issues, but there's been things that have come up that I've had an opportunity to help individuals with their relationship with the government, whether it's by introducing legislation to change the laws, or to just intervene on their behalf, or help them to get something done in their neighborhood. So that's been very rewarding for me.
Okay, and do you feel like your background in banking, do you think it kind of gives you a unique perspective, maybe compared to other people, whether it's other city council or other parts of government? Do you feel like you maybe have a little bit different vantage point?
Yeah, and especially, I guess, the area in banking in which I come from, which is on the proprietary investment side. My last position in corporate investments in Charlotte, we were making investments for the balance sheet of the bank. So we're actually buying assets for long-term investment. So you're doing a lot of valuation and credit analysis. And I think that's a different way of looking at things than most people that are involved in government, especially city government.
Okay. And so the main topic of the day, you kind of referenced it, and I would love to do a follow-up sometime where we can go into maybe some other things you're interested in. But today, I wanted to talk about electric work. So I have definitely been a supporter, not a blind supporter. I mean, I need to know facts, but to this point, anyone that knows me or has followed my content or listened to this podcast knows that I think it's a really big opportunity for the city. And I know that you've been opposed to it, which is the main reason I wanted to have you on. And again, thank you publicly just for being willing to come on and talk to someone who you knew was maybe going to have a different viewpoint.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, by the way. An opportunity to actually talk about, why I have the position I have. I have, you probably know this, over the last 4 years, I've been really demonized by having my opinions on
you have
media. And so it's nice to have an opportunity to talk to someone about it.
That's great. Well, hopefully, I'll obviously have my list of questions, but feel free to take this anywhere you want. I mean, I want this to be an opportunity for you to have a platform to share with people, and then let them make up their own mind. I'm not here to tell people what to think. I'm here to give people facts, and then they can take it and do what they will with it. So with you being openly opposed to it as it stands, is there a version of electric works that you would support, or do you just not like this project?
A version that I would support would be largely privately financed, with very little government intervention. The fact that there is, and I think you mentioned this in one of your other questions regarding brownfields, there probably is some things that we can do to help with the brownfield remediation issues, that we could get federal funding directly for that, but that's going to require a completely different approach than the approach that's being taken. Because that would, the primary approach then would be remediating a toxic environment and making it environmentally safe versus trying to preserve a historic building. So they're different approaches with completely different financial profiles.
Okay, and is it possible to not do both, like remediate the brownfields and then do the same project with the existing buildings, or would that just be an astronomical cost? Or
I think that's what they're attempting to do, and that's why the costs are so astronomical.
Okay, I got you. Okay, all right. So being libertarian, and obviously you're very conservative with tax dollars. My understanding is that the city was set to invest about $65 million. Is it roughly, give or take?
Yeah. If you include all the local government entities, it's not just the city. So there's different pies that $65 million is coming from. So you got 10 million that would be coming from the city's legacy fund. So for those that are watching, the legacy fund is a pool of money that was created when the city sold its electrical utility to I&M. And that money then has been put into a fund that's invested in lots of different projects. So one example that people may be familiar with is the Clyde Theater project at the intersection of Bluffton and Broadway. There's lots of other projects and things that money gets invested in, but that's an example.
I got you. So my understanding, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's only 10 million of what's going into electric works. There's a portion that's roughly 50 million that's coming from the food and beverage tax, which historically has gone to support the Coliseum. And so that's kind of a diversion of the Coliseum had bonds related to the renovations that it went through, I don't know, probably about a decade ago. And when that money, when those bonds have been paid off, then instead of reducing the amount of the food and beverage tax or creating another project like that, they're looking to put it into the electric works project. And then there's a small pot of income tax money from both the city and county. I think it's like $3.5 million each. So you add all that up, get to $65 million.
Okay, and then are the estimates roughly correct that right now the site generates around $120,000 a year, and if this project goes through and it's as successful as they project, it would then generate $7 million per year in tax revenue?
Depends on what timeline you're talking about. So for the next foreseeable future, it would produce no income because they've applied for super abatement from the state. So basically what that does is when the project's completed, they would pay no taxes for the next 10 years. Additionally, they're looking to bond on top of the $65 million. They're looking for anywhere between 11 and $20 million in basic redevelopment activity in the area that would be funded by TIF, that's tax increment financing. And that does not include the parking garages that were in the first proposal that the public never saw. It's basically, it's kind of a phase 1.2 prior to phase 2. So phase 2 would be the east side of Broadway, whereas phase 1 is what everyone's talking about, the 65 million going into the west side of Broadway.
Mm-hmm.
West side of Broadway, they also have envisioned parking garages that would be financed through the city using a combination of TIF and the parking revenues from the garages and potentially other sources, because a lot of times the garages themselves are not self-financing. Getting back to trying to answer your question, since we're pledging TIF to pay bonds that are going to be another $20 million, it's going to take a number of years to pay those off. And the entities that are renting from Electric Works, their tax status flows through. So, for instance, one of the tenants is Fort Wayne Community Schools. Fort Wayne Community Schools is a not-for-profit entity. They do not pay property taxes. So when they're leasing space at Electric Works will not be paying taxes on that portion of the property. There's a number of not-for-profits that are talking about renting in there. The do-it-best portion of it is the only part of it right now that I know of that is for-profit. Everything else is not-for-profit. So you're not talking about generating very much tax revenue if all these entities are tax exempt.
So does the 7 million, is that factoring in like appreciation of home values, like restaurants coming into the area, shops, and if not, how does that factor into your model on whether this is good or bad for the city?
Well, they're going to have to create a new TIF district for this, that's going to basically capture all of the growth in assessed value. So the way that a TIF works is you take a look at it at a snapshot before the year before it was created and say that's your baseline assessed value. And the taxes related to it continue to go to the places that it went to before, as long as that entity is existing. So all the restaurants, let's say if this district were to encompass something like George's International at Taylor and Broadway, or Mad Anthony Brewing, or any of those places, whatever they're paying right now in taxes would continue to go to the places that they go now. Once the TIF is created, any new value that's created by the appreciation of the properties or new investments in additional properties, those would then go to the Redevelopment Commission to finance the streets, sidewalks, and sewers that have to be put in for Electric Works. So there's no new additional revenue to the city or to the schools or anything else. All that would be kind of sucked into the project. And that would continue until those bonds are paid off, and that may take 20 years.
Okay. So where did that 7 million come from then? I don't know if I'm going to make sure I'm following this correctly.
I do not know where the $7 million number there came from. I think initially they hired a consulting company to come in and put forward some projections of new incomes that would be created by people moving to the area. But as you know, the way things have kind of played out, there's very few, if any, businesses from outside of Allen County that are showing interest in Electric Works. Everyone that has a commitment and everyone that's talked about signing a lease is already within the tax base. So it's not adding additional income or income taxes or property taxes or anything.
What about looking at it as like an investment for the future, where it's like, okay, maybe they're not adding jobs from out of the area, but you're trying to retain, local educated talent, or the high net worth empty nesters that instead of going to Florida would like to be in a more dense urban area, spend their disposable income, pay a higher rent, buy the expensive condos. Like, how do you factor that into when you're factoring whether a project's good or bad?
Well, what would your return on investment be? First, you have to determine how would we define our investment. If looking at it from a governmental standpoint, we would say the $65 million plus whatever we're looking at putting into through TIF and any ancillary additional investment that the city would put into it through public works. So if there's any additional streets or whatever that have to be funded through income taxes instead of through the property taxes from the area. So you're looking at, potentially upwards to $100 million of investment. And then you're asking the question of how do you determine whether or not we've gotten ancillary gains. And I guess you would primarily look at income taxes for that. And the additional income taxes, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the entirety of Allen County, as of a few years ago, was, I think, about $65 million in income taxes. So the net on this would be minuscule, and it would take 100 years to chip away at the total investment. So that's not a great investment.
Okay, understood. And so are you against public money going towards redevelopment in this fashion in general, or is it just this one doesn't make sense and that's why?
I think my baseline is yes, I'm against it in theory. So, we all have a set of principles, but we, occasionally we have to make compromises. So I've got kind of three, and we kind of touched on some of this a minute ago, but I've got three different perspectives that I try to look at these things through. And I guess sometimes it's not always intentional. And this is kind of the way I was trying to think about how do I come across about my decision-making grid, if you will. Mm-hmm. One, there's kind of a moral question. We'll get to that a little bit later. Two, I've got a fiduciary responsibility. So that's whether or not it's a good public policy. Is it a good deal? So I may disagree with that, the whole idea of the public policy, as far as the economics of whether or not this is great for the city or not. But is it a prudent way to invest my money? And I guess if I'm looking at it as, well, we're just going to give them this money and we hope to get economic gain from it in the future. And so I've set that hurdle aside for a moment. And I'm just looking at, well, if I'm doing this, am I spending that money wisely? So that's the fiduciary side. So let me flesh that out for you a little bit. When you're buying something, so like you're in real estate, so you have an idea of how you go about placing a value on a property, right? Mm. And you're going to have a different approach for that for residential properties, particularly if it's going to be owner occupied, than you would if you know that the primary purpose of the property is income generation.
Correct.
So this is a commercial property. You assume that we can come to some sort of valuation using commercial standards. So when the initial pro forma came out for electric works 4 years ago, I guess it was 4 years ago, it's close to that. It took a long time for this to even really get traction for council to pass a resolution. But the first stabs at a pro forma, the developers came to council, gosh, I'm trying to remember what year that was. It doesn't matter. And they kind of outlined their idea of what it was. And I had talked to them previously to get a general idea and had seen their performance. But anyway, if you took the number of square feet of the total project and you multiplied that by the square footage rental price that you would get per year, and then subtract out what you expect the expenses to be. And there's some general rules of thumb that you can use. I manage rental properties. We have commercial and residential rental properties in the J. Arp and Company portfolio. So I have a general idea that you can look for at least half of your revenues to be eaten up in expenses for maintaining the properties. there's multiple different, we won't get into all the different expenses, but there's lots of different categories. So if you take that and then discount that to present value, assuming that it's going to be there in perpetuity, so it's well maintained, it's going to live forever, and it's going to keep this cash flow coming in, and using a reasonable discount rate. I think at the time I used 6%. Probably now I'd probably have to use 5% because the Fed has continued to push rates down. But you got to show some sort of rate that shows a commercial risk, right? So I think 5% for a discount rate, maybe, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a reasonable rate. Some people may say, well, Jason, that's too high based on, the government's involvement or whatever, but we have to use some benchmark. I think 5's good enough. What we came to at that time for this half of the project was a value of about $80 million. And at that time, the proposed capital stack and the proposed expenditures are going to be $240 million. So my fiduciary responsibility was to say there's no way in the world that I would contribute to spending $240 million for something that's only worth 80. You're spending 3 times as much as what the value is in any kind of commercial sense. Now you could put some value, I guess, into some of the questions of aesthetics of the area, improvement to the city, living standards, qualities, those types of things. But how much of the difference between 80 and $240 million do you assign to things that are unquantifiable? There's no way as a prudent investor or prudent man would do that sort of thing, in my opinion. And then lastly, there's a public policy question. So first, I said the moral, and then this is the fiduciary, and then the public policy question. And there's been lots of research done on this. There's a group at George Mason University called the Mercatus Institute. Are you familiar with Mercatus?
I'm not.
Okay, they've done a lot of research on public-private partnerships and the returns to communities, and they found on balance that they've actually been a detriment to business formation. What you end up having is a situation in which the government tends to align things where it favors one company or one group of investors over others. And that's actually a deterrent to people that are looking to invest in what they see as a business-friendly environment.
Okay.
That's kind of a long way of answering the question. I did mention the moral at the very beginning. And this is something I actually wrote in a piece for the Journal Gazette that they published in, early 2018, I think. So 2.5 years ago. It's kind of the moral question of, is it right to take one group of people's money, the taxpayers, and give it to another group of people for their own private investment, in which the public doesn't have? So it's different than taking tax money and putting it into a public good. Public goods, police cars, parks. I can make an argument for parks. Living in Chicago, I can tell you that having nice parks makes Chicago a livable place. My wife and I lived in Lincoln Park for a number of years. Those types of things are those are reasonable things to do with taxpayer money. Is it a reasonable thing to take tax money and give it to a private entity and not really expect anything in return other than for that business to flourish? And so that would be like the argument that, I'm going to buy a house in a neighborhood and I'm going to tell all the neighbors that they have to give me money to improve the house, to make the house bigger or better, because by making my property value higher, it's going to benefit everybody around. Well, that's, my neighbors would probably look at me like, you're crazy. There's no way we're going to give you money to put a new roof on your house. You got to figure out how to do that yourself. So that's kind of the moral question, is it right to use taxpayer money to fund private investment? My default's got to be no.
Okay. And I think to to that vein, have you heard of the book, The Coming Jobs War? I don't know, it's probably 10 years old now or so, but it was basically a book talking about the modern currency is educated talent, and trying to build a hub that attracts them. Like it's kind of a competition amongst cities to try to retain the educated young people, or the educated older people, not just young people, but basically people with options who have disposable income and are attracted to cities like Indy, Columbus, Chicago, and trying to keep them in our ecosystem, bring in the high paying jobs. What would you say if somebody said, well, that this is an investment into retaining those people? And I think you're saying that that's just not as quantifiable as you'd like to spend that much money. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I think that there's been plenty of research on the other side that doesn't get as much, and the folks at Mercatus have done a lot of research on that topic as well. But and in fact, even Richard Florida, who was one of the first proponents of this, most recent infatuation with this idea of urban renewal, has since recanted, based on the economic performance of what his prescriptions were, that a lot of places that have put literally billions of dollars into this type of thing have not seen the returns. They have not seen people move back to the area. They haven't seen the areas retain the improvement that was put in. For instance, if you look at Baltimore, Maryland, when I was in college and shortly after, I would visit Washington, D.C. on a fairly regular basis, and occasionally go up to the Inner Harbor, where they had put a ton of money into revitalizing that area. Since then, it's become a place where people can't go. It's just not safe. And, that may point to other problems in the area, but they have not, it never really had the growth and retainment of higher income people. That you had a temporary boost based on the pouring of money into the construction industry in the area, but you never really had the uptick in high-tech jobs or whatever it was that they were looking to create. My argument would be, it's not the government's job to determine where people are going to live and who's going to live where. I think that's got to be up to individuals to make their minds up and what kind of world that they want to live in. I too was one of the young people that grew up in a town about the size of Fort Wayne, and went to college, and then went to Charlotte, and then Chicago, and then back to Charlotte. And it's Charlotte. Those places were fun, at the time, but once we started having kids, or having the desire to have kids, we decided we wanted to be in a place that had a much better cost of living and was safe. I think a lot of families find the same thing. When I was living in Chicago, the other people that I worked with, and my office was in the Sears Tower. As soon as they had kids, they all moved out to the suburbs. It's just not, you're not necessarily feeling safe having your kids in the L train.
Yeah, so I went from Fort Wayne, went to Purdue, moved to Orlando, and I was actually down in Orlando for 12 years. And once we had our third child, that was kind of the beginning of us coming back. And it's been amazing. People ask me all the time if I miss it, and I said not even a little bit. And a big part of that is like, pumping gas with my kids in the car and not having to worry about somebody coming up to ask me for money. And,
Right.
and not sound judgmental. I just meant, it would scare me, if I got my kids right there and people were approaching me, I never knew their intentions, and I didn't want to, assume. So I totally get what you're saying there. So it sounds like too, it sounds like maybe that you're saying that you can have a viable city that maybe looks different than having all the big attractions that a lot of people associate with economic development. You can still have a successful city without some of these things.
Absolutely. And I don't know if you know who James Altucher is. He writes a blog. He was a hedge fund manager in New York. He also owns a lot of playhouses and comedy clubs and restaurants in New York. And he's really talked about what the impact of this year's shutdowns related to the virus have done to that industry specifically, but also commercial property. Have you ever been to the Time Warner building in Chicago? I mean, in New York?
No.
Okay, it overlooks Central Park. It's a beautiful building. It's a miniature version of the Twin Towers, if you will, and it kind of has a place in the middle where you have this great big atrium. Beautiful building. It's 90% vacant right now. But what Altitude says is that this isn't a short-term thing related to the virus, and things are most likely not going to bounce back to where they were before, because it's just like you and I are doing right now, Jake. We're talking over the computer. He said that the thing that is changing the future of commercial real estate forever is bandwidth. The capability to have meetings, conduct business over a computer from, I'm sitting in an office in my house, which my kids use for schoolwork sometimes, to talk to you. And you could do this from a boat. You can do this in the mountains. I can do this from anywhere. And you've got hedge fund managers and bankers and lawyers and doctors all learning that they can do business from anywhere. They don't have to be in a building. And so the continued investment in commercial real estate is going to be a real question for the future, whether how much that's going to make sense, and is there going to be a discounting that's going to be put in to reflect the fact that the demand is not the same. So I think that's another thing that we need to think about. I mean, when the initial proposal for Electric Works came out and you looked at the initial pictures that they envisioned in a relatively short period of time, I don't know what their timetable was, it never was really stated, but the idea was to do both sides of Broadway, both the east and west side. If they had done that, that would have been 1.2 million square feet. And talking to people that are in the commercial real estate business in downtown Fort Wayne, they were saying that that's nearly as much as the available square feet of non-governmental square footage in all of downtown Fort Wayne. So to add that much supply to the market would really change the pricing dynamics and really could hurt some of the people that have already made pretty big investments in Fort Wayne. To subsidize an additional supply of that size. Now, I know some people would say, well, bringing in additional choices is kind of like adding, putting a Burger King on the opposite corner of a McDonald's doesn't hurt the McDonald's. It brings a place where people go to look for fast food. Or you can make an argument like on Broadway in New York, the fact that you've got more than one playhouse actually helps everybody there, not just one playhouse. You could make that argument, but when you're looking at just the idea of generic commercial real estate space, and at the time that we started having this discussion, we had a lot of vacancy in Fort Wayne downtown, and to think about adding that much supply at that time was, we don't have as much vacancy now, but we are bringing new stuff online. Over the next few years, not only are we going to see the new hotel on Main Street, but we've got a couple of buildings that have a mix of apartments, city garage, and office space along the river. And I think we're going to continue to see additional investment along the river. So anyway, it's just a question of whether or not Fort Wayne has the capacity to use all that additional square footage.
So you thought you felt maybe it was being forced a little bit, like it was an ideology or like something idealistic that was being forced with the hope of a big payoff, versus like the city is craving this, we need it, we're meeting a demand. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there were some specific actors, and I didn't want to get into any of the personalities involved in this discussion, but there was certainly some people that had interest in having this done. And I understand that. I mean, obviously, human beings are self-interested and you want to make money. And I think they did a really good job of creating a narrative that a lot of people, it's easy to get excited about something that looks like it's going to be beneficiary. And if you haven't taken the time to go through and look at the details, it's very easy to fall in love with whatever the new popular thing is. And I think Electric Works was made to be very popular. There's a very, very good public relations campaign that was put on by the developers, complete with yard signs.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it got me excited. I'm not gonna lie. It got me excited.
And here's the thing, I'll tell you this. Before I was elected, even in campaigning, I had gone by the buildings. People had talked about that being a potential idea. I thought it was pretty cool because it's really neat to see. I have a building that's 125 years old. I think it's really neat. It's a 3-story building with a basement, and it's 20,000 square feet, which is tiny compared to this. But for me, that's kind of a cool old building, and it's kind of neat to be able to use it as modern office space and to reuse old buildings, kind of keep some of our history. And my wife's grandfather worked in those electric works buildings for 50 years. For her family, they thought that would be a great reuse. It was an exciting thing. But that was before we took a look at the numbers. And I've told you earlier, obviously we have principles that guide us, but sometimes we're able to, if we get on board, kind of help steer things in a way that's going to be closer to our principles than not doing anything at all. And I was able to take that approach with Quimby Village and help to rewrite the rules and regulations related to using the legacy fund to be able to loan money to Quimby, so that way the city would get the money back and be able to reinvest in the community there. And in the long run, I think that's going to be great for that area. But it was something where we had to look at what is our involvement, how do we get the money back, and how do we make that to where that was truly a public investment and not just handing money to a private entity.
Okay, that makes sense. So kind of shifting back to something we've touched on is do it best. Let's say this project doesn't go through. Do you feel there's a risk of them going to another city, being lured by like a Columbus, like a up and coming, spending a lot of money city, or Indy or something like that, or Cincinnati, kind of the same vein? Like, do you see any risk there to losing them?
There's always a risk. It would be foolish for me to say no. If people said no to International Harbor, so they were proven wrong, that they would leave. So obviously that is a possibility. I don't think it's a high likelihood, however. They made quite an investment. The city of New Haven made quite an investment in the buildings that they're in now. They have railroad access that they use for a lot of distribution stuff. I don't see them leaving everything behind to go somewhere else, especially when you compare the cost per square foot of the space that they're in now relative to wherever it is that they'll end up going. I mean, at the end of the day, these things have to be business decisions. They have employees there that are happy to work there currently at the wages that they're getting. If they were to move to Columbus or Carmel or somewhere else, they're going to have to adjust for the fact that housing is going to be nearly twice as much. They're going to have to adjust for a lot of other cost of living things and their pay scale for employees and the pool of people that they're pulling from versus the folks that are working where they are now. And I'll tell you what, for people that have worked or lived in other places that are here in Fort Wayne now, I treasure Fort Wayne. Fort Wayne is a beautiful, clean city where people have a lot of pride in their city. And, the cost of living here is amazing. You could trade the time that was taken to finance other styles of living with being able to spend that much more time with family and friends and enjoying life here in Fort Wayne. It really is a treasure.
Yeah, you basically just said my story. My wife, had a successful sales career. She now was able to stay home with the children from this move here. Our house doubled in size and was almost half the price of what we were paying in Orlando. So that hits the nail on the head exactly. So, okay, that makes sense. And I was going to talk about Durham and the American Tobacco Campus, but I don't know. I think we kind of covered your philosophy on that.
I don't mind talking about that for a moment because I have done some research on that. Obviously, it's up to us to educate ourselves on what else is going on, and that was one of the things that was brought up as a success for the development team. They were involved there under the name Stroiver Brothers, Eccles and Royce, and when they built that project, they actually ran into some financial problems. Now, some of that may have been related to the financial crisis that happened kind of during when all this was going on, but you found out at the end of the day that the project was worth roughly about a third of what the total construction cost was when you add up all the soft costs and the hard costs, which is the same ratio that I told you about earlier when we're looking at electric works. If you go to the Durham County Assessor's website, you can take a look at what the assessed value is today versus when they had completed construction. It's about a third today. And many of the buildings, especially the ones that Stoiber Brothers owned when they completed the project, all went through some sort of foreclosure restructuring. So investors lost their shirts in those projects. And that part of the story was never discussed at a council meeting. It was never, obviously the developer's not going to bring it up. Mm-hmm. And when I brought up those difficulties, they were dismissed. And I don't think that my colleagues on council necessarily had much of an appetite to discuss that either. So the pretty pictures of American Tobacco Campus were certainly admissible. And a lot of people like to talk about those, but they did not want to talk about the financial realities.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of basing it on the end product too. So my mother-in-law was the president of the chamber there for many years, and was a part of that. Now lives on the campus, and from what I've seen is places that people wouldn't feel safe going are now the highest rent in town. They got the Durham Performing Arts Center as a part of that. It kind of piggybacked off that, and now they're kind of viewed as like a tech startup hub where people who burn out on New York City and some of the bigger ones are returning to the area. And I do think you have to factor in Research Triangle. You have some of the top schools in the area. So it's not that we have great people here, but it's just a different setting, and I understand that as well. But I guess my support of the project initially was looking at what they had and looking like at what it's done to the area, and then wanting that for Fort Wayne. I mean, that was really the crux of it.
Yeah, I think one big difference is that Duke University ended up making a big investment in the restructuring and has put offices there. And I think that's had a lot to do with the kind of making it become having the appearance of viability. Okay. I'm not sure that having Ivy Tech is as great as Ivy Tech may be for a lot of folks. I'm not sure that that's going to have the same impact.
I understand. No, I definitely understand that. And I think that's fair. So is there any projects that I don't even know if you're allowed to talk about this, or is there anything else besides Electric Works that you would prefer to see happen? Or is it just not Electric Works the way it's structured, not because you have something else in mind?
Well, I'll go back to, obviously I mentioned earlier, I do have, moral problems with taking taxpayer money and giving it directly to private investors. I think one of the things I had worked on and would like to do again this year, we had some other things that kind of threw council, and everyone else for a loop, and having to deal with all of the issues related to the virus management. Mm-hmm. But I would like to revisit the idea of exempting all new investments in business personal property from taxation. It's something that I proposed several years ago. Having talked to many manufacturers and people that are capital equipment intensive, eliminating that tax would, I think, really help to maybe turn this into even more of a artisan and a place where you could take capital and turn it into high-paying jobs. For instance, if you look at Sabre is somebody that has been investing a lot here. They bought the old Molinex. Are you familiar with any of this?
No, I'm sorry.
So they make clamshells for food.
Okay.
And that may not be exciting to you, but to be able to produce millions of items, a month and be able to, they're the largest producer of that in the world. And they've got factories all over the world. Their headquarters is in New Jersey, and they've been investing quite a bit to put their R&D facility here near the airport. They brought in 400 new jobs. These are jobs that are paying, on average $75,000 a year, which is quite a bit above the average household income in Fort Wayne. And they're doing that because they're moving from New Jersey. So as many questions as I have about our competitive abilities, it's a lot better in New Jersey, and it's a lot better in California, where they have a lot of other investments. But they had questions about between here and Texas. They eventually decided to settle on here because they already purchased the Molinex facility. But by doing away with the tax on business equipment, being able to bring machinery, computer investment, the more productive your workforce is, the more they're going to get paid. The more units of production per person per hour, it raises the standard of living for everyone. And I think the best way to do that is to encourage capital investment in equipment, as opposed to buildings. So we talked about the difficulties that commercial buildings are going to have in the long run. I don't think that subsidizing commercial buildings is the way to grow the community. I think growing in technology, whether it's manufacturing technology or other technologies, medical technologies, having an environment where people can do that with less governmental interference. So right now, like, for instance, General Motors comes and they apply to IEDC to give them super abatement. So they'll invest in equipment and not pay any taxes on it for the next 10 years. Other companies will come and they don't get super abatement, but they get a regular 10-year abatement in which their taxes are phased in over 10 years. So they pay nothing the first year, a little bit the next, and then at the end of 10 years, they're paying whatever the full rate is. My proposal was just to do away with that tax, because we are having to manage and decide who gets abatement, who doesn't get, abatement. If we just got rid of that, then we no longer have to do the abatements. We no longer have to do as much TIF activity, because right now, I mean, so much of TIF is being used to finance the construction of commercial buildings. For instance, Great Lakes Capital built the Skyline Tower where Ruth Chris is, and they got a TIF bond for $5 million. So TIF, by law, by state statute, is only able to invest in public infrastructure. But the Redevelopment Commission and Council approved a $5 million bond for that to invest in various pieces of steel related to the elevator shafts and the structure of the building, and deemed that to be public property, even though the building is owned, operated, and managed by Great Lakes Capital. That's $5 million that the taxes for that portion of it are going to be going, to funding that bond, as opposed to going to the things that taxes normally go to, like police, fire, and schools, and street repair, that kind of stuff. If we do less of that and more of just allowing, no taxes to be collected on equipment, and that can be computer equipment or any kind of equipment. I think that creates a free market environment that businesses would be interested in being involved in, as opposed to having to partner with government to finance their buildings.
Okay, I actually just had to talk about this with some friends of mine over the weekend, just about like the opportunity costs. If you're paying more in taxes, and that's less than you can invest in the business, which produces more income and more jobs. So you're saying, instead of siphoning off money, reinvesting it in a big project in the hopes that it entices people in, you want to make it more profitable for businesses just to operate here, both with their expenses and then with their employees' cost of living. So kind of everyone wins. And then we get the arbitrage of, coincidentally timing it with this virus, now with people being even more remote than they were before, they can come live here for cheap, they can manufacture for, less, and then we're more competitive that way. Is that kind of your general philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the virus is something new this year, but I made the proposal of getting rid of business personal property tax. I think it was 2016, I talked about it. In 2017, we put forward the bill. We got 3 out of the 9 council members to vote for it. But that was heavily opposed by Greater Fort Wayne because it really is a change in your mode of operation. Instead of investing in commercial property, commercial real property like buildings and stuff, you're basically letting people keep their money to invest in equipment. So that way they're making their workforce more productive and making more money.
Would you mind playing devil's advocate with yourself there? What are some of the risks of that? Like what could be something that could go wrong? Like we obviously know with electric works, the risk is you spend all this money, it flops, and then we're just done. What's the risk of, with your strategy, lowering that tax or eliminating it to try to entice businesses to manufacture here?
Well, if you coupled it with no longer extending new abatements and you let the current portfolio of abatements run off. So we've got, 200 properties for the city and a number, I don't know how many the county has, but a number of properties in the county that are under abatement that are going to run off over 10 to 15 years. And then you have all of these TIF financings that are also going to run off over a time period of anywhere between 5 to 15 years. Maybe there might be a couple that are 20 now. But anyway, these things, if you don't do any more of that, it's running off. You're capturing back the tax revenue that you lost from extending these incentives in the first place. So we've already done the damage financially. Mm-hmm. And in the future, it's going to be less each year unless you do more of it, right? Mm-hmm. So instead of doing more of that, why don't we allow new investments in equipment to not be taxed, whereas the current population of commercial equipment is taxed and will continue to be taxed unless you bring in new equipment. That's going to take 15 years to run off as well. It may not be straight line. There's different lives for different types of equipment, but so there's a time period in which you're going to be trading one for the other without a financial impact directly to any of the taxing entities. There's some trade-offs between what school districts get how much tax revenue. There's some trade-off as to whether it's the county or the city or where the tax revenue is going. But as a whole, as a county, you would be more or less flat. And I did a big analysis on that, and I published it in Indiana Policy Review in late 2016. If you want, I can dig that up and forward it to you if you want to make that available to
yeah, I can link
folks.
This.
But the general idea would be that you can invest here without having to go through a city organization to sponsor your business to get special tax treatment and just not have to deal with that or pay the taxes on the equipment. And I think there's a lot to be said for getting the gatekeepers out of the way and allowing people to operate more organically. Because right now, if you're a business coming to town, the typical way that it works is you're going to communicate with the chamber, which is Greater Fort Wayne, and the economic development group within the city. And they're going to try to put together a portfolio of incentives to try to get you to invest here versus saying, you know what, we've already got the best cost of living in the country. Real estate here is really cheap relative to other places, especially bare ground. And that's just the benefit of the geography. We don't have mountains, we don't have oceans, we don't have a lot of things that are in the way of putting a building up. It's all pretty flat, and you put a building anywhere, and construction costs are relatively cheap relative to large cities like Chicago or New York or anything like that. So for us to continue to push on the string of commercial real estate, when the long-term trend I think is going to be a headwind on commercial real estate values, because there is a backlog was built back in 2007. I got to play a little bit of part in the world of commercial mortgage-backed securities. So there was a ton of buildings that were built just because there were mortgages that need to be made, if you will. The financing was there, and so people wanted to build structures and in order to keep that pipeline going. But so anyway, there's still a backlog of square footage that's in place, I think. maybe not so much in Fort Wayne, but in especially in the Midwest in general. You look at places like Cleveland and Cincinnati, where there's not the same demand to be downtown that there used to be. And a lot of that has to do with the consolidation in the banking industry and a lot of the financial industry. There's been so much consolidation that part of it is just the change in technologies. Believe it or not, when I started in banking in 1997, the very first job I had for a brief period of time as they're training me, I didn't even have a computer. I had a 10 key, and I had to fill out paper forms with the debits and credits related to what it was that we're doing and take them to the computer operator to be entered.
Oh my gosh.
So things have changed a lot in that time period. And even when I was there, I saw those departments where I had started. By the time I had left, I had known some people that kind of stayed in that side of the business. There was probably a third of the employees just 10 years later as there were early on. So the need for commercial space in these big office towers is not the same as it used to be.
Okay. No, that makes perfect sense. And I don't want to, I could talk to you for hours, honestly, and maybe we can do a follow-up down the road if you're open to it. But I guess kind of to start wrapping up, I got maybe 2 more questions, but what's maybe a misconception about you? Like you said, you were kind of vilified in the media, which I would agree with. I think you were. Is there any misconceptions about you that you'd want to clear up now while you got the platform?
I don't know specifically. To be honest with you, I don't read a lot of the press about me anymore, so I'm not even sure what those misconceptions would be. I do look at these things, and let me like my phone's ringing. Let me just there. It was kind of being a distraction to me. I guess I don't know. I'm not sure how to put this other than people will categorize you as, well, he just votes no on everything. Well, the fact of the matter is that I've voted to support parks. I've voted to support trails. I've voted to support many street improvements, sewer improvements. I do draw the line at raising taxes on people. I think that raising taxes harms the general environment, harms the business environment, makes it puts a dent in our easy cost of living, which is one of the great benefits of being here. So I think that if we manage what we get plenty of revenue. It's just applying it judiciously and being good stewards of what the taxpayers have granted us to work with.
Okay, that's great. And then the final question, something I ask everyone: what's your favorite thing about living in Fort Wayne?
Well, I mean, we talked about it a little bit earlier with just the low cost of living has certainly allowed us to allow my wife to stay home and be with the kids, and we homeschool. So that's been fantastic for us. There's a great homeschool community here. That's got to be one of the top things for us. Is there is a community of people that really care about their families, and it's very family centric. Compared to other places where maybe people don't get to see their kids but a couple hours a day, and that's because they can't afford to live unless that's the way they live. And so I don't know. My kids are an enormous part of my life, and I'm so glad that we're able to spend as much time with them as we are.
Yeah, no, I've said this already, but I mean, that's exactly the way I feel. I mean, it was my wife and I's career. On paper, everything was great in Orlando. People couldn't believe that we were leaving. But I just felt like it wasn't, the family just structure wasn't there for us. And through moving, we've been able to blossom in a way that I just never even thought was going to happen. So it's been pretty awesome. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I'm a little mad at you. I kind of wanted to just come away disagreeing with you, but you made some really good points today. I've been supporting this thing for years. But seriously, thank you so much. I hope that everyone that sees this understands, like, you care very deeply. You have a history of financing. Fort Wayne is front of mind. It's clear that you've put the time in. You didn't talk in any hyperbole or fear, at least to me, I didn't hear any fear tactics here without any of this. This was all logic based, and that means a lot to me as well. So thank you so much for your time today.
Hey, I appreciate the opportunity. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Absolutely. See ya.